Let's turn to Quebec now. The province is launching an action group to address racism in that province. Premier François Legault has taken criticism in recent weeks for denying that systemic racism exists in Quebec, a claim he repeated today. Despite that, he did admit that racism is an issue in the province. Have a listen to his words exactly.
We were all touched by what happened in the United States. We don't want to import the climate of confrontation. There's a consensus on two things in Quebec. First, the vast majority of Quebecers are not racist. But two, there is racism in Quebec. So we must act against racism by working together. We can't tolerate racism in Quebec anymore.
For more on this, we've reached Christopher Skeet. He's Premier Legault's Parliamentary Assistant for Relations with English-speaking Quebecers. He joins us from Laval, I believe. Hi, Mr. Skeet. Good to see you as always.
Very nice to see you. And yes, I'm from Laval.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure I had the right location there. Mr. Skeet, let me start off on the working group, because you will be a member of that group. Can you explain to us exactly what it will be doing?
Yeah, it's an executive task force. Our job is going to be to look at different areas where we can quickly move the needle on certain issues with regards to racism in Quebec. We're talking employability. We're talking about housing. We're talking about racial profiling and police encounters with minorities in general. So it's an all-encompassing endeavor, and I'm very happy. This is really good news for us.
I'm glad you provided the details, because I have to say the first thought I had when I heard the announcement, because there weren't a huge amount of details provided at the time, but was sort of like, why do we need another study? Why do we need another report? I heard the report out from Montreal today. There have been others in the past year that unequivocally stated that racism and systemic racism exists in many of the structures and authority structures in Quebec. But are you saying that this will not be sort of trying to assert that or study that again? It will just be looking at actual things that can be done?
Yeah, exactly. The Premier is action-oriented. He's the type of guy where he doesn't want to sit in the room and contemplate and write reports. I think we have enough reports. I think you're dead on with that. What we're looking for is concrete action that we can take in order to move the needle on certain things. For instance, he was disheartened today when he said that, the unemployment rate for visible minorities in Quebec is a lot higher than it should be, a lot higher than the average. And when we look at employment in the public service, the Quebec public service, it's also disappointing. So he wants concrete actions that we can take to fix the problem.
What is the chance that those actions are actually taken by your government? And I ask because I know that the report, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it is due in the fall. So that's a pretty quick timeline. Is there any commitment to act on it? Or will these kind of be what we've seen in other instances, and not just in Quebec, but across the country, a report that produces recommendations that are then kind of sat on for months or years to come?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, history has taught us that sometimes governments sort of, want to show that they're doing something and then they push it aside. But honestly, Premier Legault is a type of guy where he says he's going to do something, he does it. And in this case, he wants us to come up with concrete actions. He's not a guy that wants us to sit around and discuss, philosophy about how, it should be and what we could be doing actually, rather than doing what we should be doing actually. What he wants is concrete measures. He wants us to come up with proposals that will move the needle on employability. He wants us to move the needle on racial profiling. He wants us to move the needle on discrimination when people are looking for housing. So he wants concrete action. It's the reason why we're choosing this executive avenue. I think it's a faster way for us to get things done, and it allows us to do it by the fall.
Will there be a mechanism for accountability? Is there, for example, metrics that will be produced out of this that then Quebecers can say, hey, you fell short here, or hey, you fell short here? Because I do have to say that in the past few weeks, one of the many things I've learned is that those mechanisms for accountability are sorely lacking in this country.
I think you're right. Having myself been a victim of the failure to act over the course of my lifetime, I can tell you that the problem has been KPIs and metrics. What we're hoping to do is come up with something that's going to actually do something in the fall. So, I think what it is people will have a choice to determine whether or not we did enough at the next election, right? We're halfway through our mandate. I think people will have a chance to judge us on our actions at that point. But honestly, We have two co-presidents that are of Black descent. We have the Minister for Native Affairs that's with us, as well as her parliamentary secretary. There's me, of course, with the English community component, and also I'm a visible minority and the Premier's right-hand man. I think we have all the right people in place to do a really good job here.
I want to ask you, Mr. Skeed, about something we've spoken about before and the clip that we heard from the Premier. I know that the Premier has sort of argued, I guess, with the contention that systemic racism exists. He says not all Quebecers are racist, but yes, there is racism in Quebec. I know that you, like so many Canadians, have watched events of the last 2 weeks unfold, and in particular saw the comments from the Commissioner of the RCMP, Brenda Lucki, and her deputy in Alberta, at first resisting the idea that systemic racism exists, particularly in the RCMP, and then days later reversing their position. I know that in our last discussion, you also agreed with the Premier's assessment. You didn't want to get sort of bogged down in the definition of it, if I'm characterizing your comments correctly. Have you reconsidered your position after seeing what's unfolded in this country over the past few weeks?
Actually, what's important for me is action. We can have a discussion about systemic racism, about the word. I think it means different things to different people. So instead of dying on the hill of systemic racism, I'd rather die on the hill of getting things done. I want to get things done. I want my kids to have a better tomorrow, and I want their future to be better and brighter than mine was. I want Black people to not be afraid when they're, engaging and being met by the police. I want them to feel safe when they're walking around different neighborhoods, and I want people to be able to shop for a house. I want a biracial couple like myself to be able to shop for a house without having to worry about having to do unrealistic conditions placed upon them or just simply being refused outright. So, you know what, we can have a discussion about the word, and I think, I'm not there, as you know. I think I want concrete action, and I want to make tomorrow better than it is today. And I think that's what Quebecers want.
Yeah, I certainly understand that point, and that's why I started our discussion on the actions that the government plans to do. But I also have taken the point from so many people, including my last guest, Senator Dick, to whom an acknowledgement that exists, that the systems in this country deliver disproportionate outcomes for minorities in this country, is important because it addresses the systems and the people who lead those systems, including politicians, including the Commissioner of the RCMP. It addresses their ability to adequately solve the problem. Like, how can you, Senator Dick's point was, how can you fix the problem if you can't really define what it is? And I think
most, if I may, Vashti, I think most Quebecers agree that racism shouldn't exist. I think most Quebecers agree that we live in our province, there are racist individuals. And I think when the Premier says he wants immediate action because, the clock has run out on those types of behaviors, does it really matter in terms of what vocabulary we're using? I think we're all on the same page. And I think there is a wide consensus in Quebec and in Canada, for that matter, that racism needs to be stomped out wherever it is and whatever institution it lives in. Now, whether or not we can agree on the word, I think is moot, as long as we're all, rowing in the right direction of trying to fix this problem.
But I think that from at least, and again, I'm interpreting what I've been told, that it's not just defining it, right? It's acknowledging that that systems that are in place, are going to affect white people and Black people, to take, for example, very differently. And you can take policing. For example, there are many studies in Montreal, in Toronto, that show police will use force against visible minorities at a far greater degree than they would on a white person. How can you adequately fix policing if you don't acknowledge that that is the case? I think, to me, that's what I have been told. And if the Premier is refusing to say that the systems, the structures in and of themselves deliver those unequal outcomes, but rather just that racism exists, how can Quebecers really, really believe that he will adequately address the issue?
Well, ultimately, I think the case that I'm making, Vashti, is that we all agree what should be written in the book. I don't want to have an argument and a long-winded discussion about what the title of the book should be. I'm more of a concrete action type of guy. I say, let's write the book and we'll worry about the title later. And for me, what's in the book is a lot more important and really hits home, and it makes my life better, makes my kids' life better, makes my friends' life better if we fix those problems. And we can worry about labels later. But honestly, seeing as how various experts don't agree, some people think it means one thing, some people think it means another, I really don't want to die on that hill. For me, it's all about the actions that we're going to take and moving the needle in a real way for everyday Quebecers and Canadians.
Do you think, Mr. Skeet, that the systems in Quebec in place, the structures of power, deliver unequal outcomes for people depending on the color of their skin or their race?
I think that's a very complicated question because I have been impacted by racism in Quebec. I've been called, gross names. I've been told that I couldn't date certain girls because I wasn't the right race. I've heard those things, but at the same token, a lot of really influential people in my life happen to be, middle-aged white males. So it's a very mitigated experience that we have being a visible minority in Canada because we have a varied experience where there's good and there's bad. And I think if we look at the face of all the bad and we call it out and we take action to minimize it, I think that's what we can do. And I think that matters more than the simple label that we want to place on it. So for me, I'm very comfortable with the initiative that we've put together to move the needle on these issues.
Okay, I'm out of time. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Skeet. Pleasure to have you with us as always.
Thanks as always. Take care, Vashi.
Christopher Skeet is Premier Legault's Parliamentary Assistant for Relations with English-speaking Quebecers.